Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. We're continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are on chapter 41. So we'll just jump right in. All right. So it starts off, the great scholar, hearing the Tao, tries or is able to practice it. And the reason I have is able in brackets here is that it appears the older versions of the Tao Te Ching that they've uncovered actually stated as is able, whereas the later and more standard translation or source of the Tao Te Ching actually has tries. So it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure how that transition happened between those two ways of stating it, but we can go with either or. Um, Now, the term that's being translated as scholar here, the reason it's not using something like sage or even person like we've seen before is this is actually in reference to someone who's involved in either aspiring to or is involved in leadership position, like within the government. So it's like a counselor or an advisor or maybe even a manager of sorts. So here they're saying that the truly great ones, on hearing about the Tao, they try or they're able to actually practice it. The middling scholar, hearing the Tao, sometimes has it, sometimes not. The lesser scholar, hearing the Tao, has a good laugh. Without that laughter, it wouldn't be Tao. I think Dane actually brought this up a few weeks ago about on hearing about the Tao, it makes you laugh. So it's interesting that this could conceivably be looked at in two different directions. One is actually a descending from someone who's actually proficient and actually gets the Tao, or at least tries to implement it, down through the fool who just kind of laughs it off, or in what would not be inconsistent with a lot of Taoist thinking is that it often plays the fool. It's the idea that it seems ridiculous. And maybe that laughter would be an example of somebody who actually truly gets it. So different translators have kind of run with this in different ways, but I'm actually going to go with the descending. And the reason I'm thinking about it that way is because they're talking specifically about scholars and not just people. And if we think back to chapter 17, we see a similar thing happening with leaders. So again, in this position of, how the government is working, where it was definitely presented in a descending order. So the best leaders are those that the people hardly know exist, right? They're enabling the system to flourish in such a way that people are able to really thrive, and they don't even realize somebody's kind of behind the scenes. At the end of this chapter, I believe, is the one where people accomplish things because of how the leaders kind of set it up, but they all say we did it ourselves, right? So the leader's almost invisible, and then the next best leader is the one who's loved and praised. And this would, again, tying it into like the Confucius way of looking at things, this would be the ideal ruler, one who's really acknowledged. And here in the Tao Te Ching, it's actually second best. Then comes one who is feared. So this would be more the legalists who are trying to actually have a very strong controlling arm over the people and using strong laws to keep everybody in line. And then the worst is the one who's despised, the one who's not even respected. So in thinking about how the leadership functions work, and given the fact that what we're talking about in this chapter is a class of people that are actually working in that context, I think that the implication here is that we're also looking at a descending way of looking at things, that the one who laughs is one who really honestly doesn't get it. But the one who's at the top of the list, the best, as it says, is one who's actually striving to understand it and enact it. So for the balance of how we look at this chapter, I'll be proceeding from that perspective, but just be aware that there's people who will definitely take the opposite position. But see how this plays out, and see if this doesn't make a little bit more sense to the text. So it continues. So after it says, if it didn't give a good laugh, it wouldn't be, the Tao. Now it's going to get into, well, what is laughable about this? Why would they say that? And so there's going to be a couple of examples here then of how pursuing the Tao is going to look contraintuitive. And maybe this is a good point also about the laughter. If what the Taoist sage was presenting was in keeping with what people already thought or believed, then it would just be like, oh, well, of course. But it's because it seems to be so contrary to accepted thinking that is where the laughter comes from. It just seems absurd. Like, what are you talking about? How that couldn't possibly work, kind of an idea. And so if we think then from that position of how do we do leadership? How do we do government? We've got this idea of the road, which is, again, another kind of parallel to this idea of way. So when we're thinking about that way or that path that government is trying to achieve, they might see it in terms of this idea of bright, and we're seeing it contrast here with dark. So we've got kind of this yin yang potential here. So what might that be? Well, in traditional forms of management or leadership, there's a lot of the goals that you're trying to achieve are how do we control? How do we bring order? How do we manage things? And this would definitely be yang ideas. These would be the white or the bright side of the yin yang. And what do we see consistently being brought up within the Daodejing is more of this insistence on the yin, which would be the dark. And so here, we see the first big contrast in terms of what is the goal or how should government be acting. And whereas normally it would be this idea of how do we control and keep things in order, these Taoists are bringing up this idea that actually we need to be maybe more creative. We need to be more open to new things. We need to embrace more of that yin side of things. And of course, this is going to potentially be met with that laughter. The next part says, in terms of the road or the way, forward seems to retreat, which is exactly what we were looking at in the last chapter, where it talks about this idea that there's the movement of Tao is to return, this more secular kind of way of looking at things. And so it seems as though it's going in the wrong direction, or it's not going forward in the way that the more culturally accepted ways of doing things are. And then finally, the level road or way seems rough. And I can't help but thinking about this whole issue of the uncarved wood, especially, as we're kind of bringing in these ideas that, there's the standard model is we carve everything up and we make everything fit and we make everything flat. And here they're suggesting, no, we need to leave room for that variation, that, diversity, that creativity, and that's going to make things seem very rough as opposed to the flat, level, smooth way that would be the normal approach. So here were a couple of implications in terms of the Tao and how that would be contrary to the standard, bringing about that laughter. Now it's going to move into some examples from Da. Maybe just before I do that, any thoughts, questions, or observations about this first part?
I'm getting a lot of the road less traveled vibes off of it.
Yeah.
You see a nice paved road and you think, oh, this is the way to go. But then you see the dirt path road that's no one takes. And that's actually the better road.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even in that opening statement where you've got the different levels of scholars, it's almost kind of trying to trigger that a little bit, like trying to appeal to the person who's wanting to, maybe take the narrow road or the difficult road or the road less traveled, right? Because it's right versus just following the crowd on the broad, open, well paved road. Yeah. It's interesting how they're taking Tao here as road as well. I think it kind of opens up, the multiple meanings of what's going on here, but it definitely helps tie it into more of that kind of like government agenda and how these things kind of play out differently. Okay, so moving into the duh section, great duh seems hollow. And here hollow is the idea of valley. And we've seen valley multiple times here in terms of that center for life because things flow down into it. And again, we're kind of at this contrary because it's the low as opposed to the high that is the source of where life is coming from. But we saw in chapter 38, as we moved into the section that really focuses on duh, that duh in its true sense is things by their nature just acting in a sense naturally, right? Fully embracing and displaying the Tao at work, these patterns. And the in a sense, the corruption or the co-opting of Da in terms of this idea of virtue that someone's trying to achieve then changes the whole dynamics of how that works. And we really focused on that on chapter 38 if you want to go back and review. But here, if they're coming from this idea of, again, we're dialoguing with the partners, right? The non-Taoist in this discussion. And it's suggesting that, if you've got this idea of the great duh, this idea of this virtue that's trying to be lived up to and that you're striving for, what's being presented from the Taoist perspective can seem empty or hollow. It can seem like it's not duh. It can seem like exactly the opposite. And we definitely have come across that argument earlier. Then I believe this section, because it's kind of buried in with other duh statements, is still trying to stay within that realm of thinking in terms of this ethical behavior concerns, but it's not explicitly using duh in this this statement. So great purity or this bright white seems sullied. And here, if we're thinking from again, this virtue interpretation of Da and what that might look like in terms of that purity. I don't think they're going down the road of like modern day concerns about like chastity or something along those lines. I think it has more to do with the appropriate behavior, almost more like we might say honorable type behavior. This would be recognizing your place within the hierarchy, how you show respect to those above you and listen to orders, you're loyal to the party, that kind of a thing. But here, what then is being expressed within the Taoist concept is definitely not just following the party line. It's much more about, what is it's much more critical of socially constructed ways of doing things or social expectations, and it's much more concerned about the natural way of things. And so it could come across as something very disrespectful, dishonorable. And I think that might be part of what's coming into play here, and at least one of the other scholars I looked at read this along those same lines. Continuing with the da, it says pervasive da seems deficient. So I think this would be again those contrasting ways of how they're thinking about da. If da is virtue, it appears one way. But if you're saying that Da is just really more this manifestation of Tao in the sense of natural and it's everywhere, all of a sudden maybe it doesn't seem to hold that same kind of value or that potency because it's no longer being looked at as this virtuous thing that you're trying to achieve. And same here, established seems furtive. So maybe these ethical positions that have been established that are trying to be looked at from like these elements of virtue that would make up that you're trying to achieve, well, maybe those are now being questioned. Maybe those positions that have been socially accepted are not as stable as they seemed originally. And then along the same lines, then this idea of simple truths could also be looked at as this idea of established ways of doing things or things that we've taken for granted or things that we all know now are up for grabs in a sense. They seem to change. They're not given their, in a sense, respect in terms of their ongoing or what's the word? Kind of like the cultural significance that they've had doesn't isn't the justification, right? It's just because it's always been this way isn't sufficient. Now we're going to go to a little bit more, I don't want to say concrete examples, but some stuff more specifically about how this plays out from the Taoist perspective. And the first one is quite interesting. The great square has no corners. And this one, I don't know if it hits you as odd, but it definitely hit me as odd. And there are a lot of different scholars that I look at in terms of, trying to decipher some of these things. And there was only one that actually had something I thought really meaningful to say about this. But a lot of the the direction that some of these things went was in thinking about the contrast that is made between heaven and earth. They would say that heaven would be depicted as a circle and earth as a square. So maybe the great square had to do with the earth. And because it's so broad, you can't see the corners. But then you have to think, well, what does that actually have to do with anything? How, and maybe there's a way you can get there, right? Or the others are just, kind of running along the lines of this is an example of, like a Cohen type of an idea where it's completely illogical and it's meant to kind of break your mental logical thought patterns and just admit kind of more of this felt experience of life rather than this kind of rational way of trying to sort things out. Never been a big fan of that myself. So I kept looking, and there's this one old book, 1954, so 70 years old this year. And the only guy that seemed to kind of pick up on something here that I think is actually really relevant. So let me kind of share a little bit what that was. So the phrase here that we're looking at for great square, we've like DA, not DE, is the word for great. And we've come across this before. And then Feng is this word that is actually square, but we have to get at, well, how are they using this? What does this mean? And what was a good find here in this book is that you have the similar phrase being used in the Zhuangzi, which is another classical Taoist text. And in here, it's translated a couple of different ways. One is the great purview, and the other is the great method. And I'm sure there's many more. These are just a couple that I happen to have access to. But as you can see, they're not actually translating it as square. And in the context where this is happening, it seems to be using it in the sense that, with purview or method, that there's a there's something going on in terms of how they're using this to arrive at something. Hence the great method, that there's a tool that's being used, or the great purview, a way of looking at things that is really kind of shaping the way things look. And as I dived into the classical Chinese dictionary, what we see is it can also be thought of along the lines of like foursquare or proper or morally right or regular tendencies. And so now we can start to see even some stuff that we use in our own language, right? When we talk about squaring something up, what do we mean by that? Anybody want to take a stab at, if we say we're squaring something up, what are we saying?
It means we're closing a loop.
Closing a loop? Any
Yeah,
other?
as in
Mm.
closing something off or bringing something current. Like if you owe somebody money and you pay them back, you say you're getting squared up.
Oh yeah,
You
that, so
close
that would
that
be
loop.
it. Yeah, I
So
hadn't even
Yeah,
thought
I
about
think
it.
the
if you're
context.
getting ready to go somewhere and you're all finished and ready to go, then you're all squared up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything's squared away. Or like if you're trying to square something in construction, you're like giving it a clean angle, or you making it level, or
Everything
something like
fits.
that.
Yeah, I was kind of going on that route of like it means like you are defining something or decisively defining something, which if that's the case, the great squares, no corners would mean, in my mind, it's incomprehensible to human definition or confines of reality.
Yeah. So if we're using square, like a square, which is
I
a
think if you were using it in the time that book was written, it would mean an uncool person.
yeah, definitely in that time frame, huh? Uh, yeah. So if we're thinking about how we would square things, especially if we're thinking like within construction or something like that, and we use a square, which actually looks like an L, uh, then, this tool is helping us to get things to align or come together or fit together in a certain way. And so okay, now we've got a little bit of an idea that if we're using the great square, like this great approach, then, and in the sense of how it's maybe being translated here as the great method or the great purview, in terms of how do we see things and cause things to either be properly aligned or fit together or closing that loop or whatever idea we're talking about. What's interesting then is if it's saying that there's no corners, well, this is entirely different than the kind of square that we would use, right? Because how how, how do you make things true? How do you line them up if there's no straight edge? And I think again we're getting to kind of the core of where a lot of this Taoist thinking is going, is that attempt to try and get everything to be flat, to be squared up, to be shaved, smooth, and level, is where all this resistance is coming from in terms of the social unrest of that Warring States period. That in fact, what we need to have is that allowance for that uniqueness and that difference. And how do we find a space for all that to work together more harmoniously rather than trying to get everything to conform? And so here, then, that great method or that way of shaping things up doesn't actually have corners because it's not trying to do it the same way. I think that the way that we're seeing here with these other definitions actually makes this make a lot of sense, whereas before it just seemed utterly baffling. What do you guys think?
Could this be a way of saying that in an ultimate sense, things are actually perfect as exactly as they are? Like you might think that
Hmm.
if you want to make something perfect, you have to clear it off, or you have to change it, or you have to make it square or flat or leveled or polished or whatever. But actually, just the way it is already perfect.
I think that would be a something really consistent with a lot of the Taoist thinking. There's kind of two different ways, even within Taoism, it can be looked at, because they're definitely not opposed to actually doing things or having particular goals or trying to accomplish things, because that's part of what you actually do as a living creature, right? And but the question is, what is your motivation? What is your goal? Where are you going with it? And that's where they really question things quite a bit. So I think on the one hand, they're like, yeah, there's some things that you don't want to be trying to change because it doesn't make sense. It's against, the ideals of what that would look like from a natural sense. And so in that case, it's more of this hands off. In some other areas, they would say, yeah, we need to work on shaping this, especially when they're talking about the changing of that social constructions or the values that the culture holds, or even this chapter where it's really, taunting in a sense, the scholars to say, you're laughing at this thing, but really you need to take it serious, right? So it's just in terms of how that change is made is maybe the corners here could be thought also in terms of this idea of certainty or moral rectitude. It's the idea that things are a little bit more loose, that they're a little bit more fluid, and that even though we're working towards a change, we're not so, uh, we're trying to deaden our hubris in terms of thinking that we've got it all figured out, that maybe things are a little bit more amorphous. So yeah, I think it can go both those directions.
Jim, do you know who Stan Groff is?
What's the name?
Stan Groff.
It's not ringing the bell.
Okay, I thought you might know him. He's basically the grandfather of transpersonal psychology, and I heard this from him. He was quoting somebody. I might have been Swami Muktananda or some Swami from way back that he was quoting, who was giving a lecture and said, the world, the whole universe is just exactly perfect, exactly the way it is, just as it is. And somebody in the audience stood up and said, how can you say that? How can you say the world is perfect? There's all this injustice and there's suffering and all these terrible things. We've got to fix it. We've got to make it better. And the Swami says, everything in the whole world, including your desire to make it better, is perfect, just the way it is.
Yeah. There's a real interesting dialogue between Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth that is almost parallel to that exactly. It's one of my favorite lines or passages out of there.
Stan Groff is friends with Joseph Campbell.
Oh, well, maybe that's where he picked up that concept.
Well, I
Or,
think he might have heard it himself directly, but I'm sure they shared stories and stuff.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I think this actually went from this particular line for me went from the what the heck to something that's actually kind of useful and makes a lot of sense. So I was happy that I stumbled across that old commentary on this.
It's interesting to me. Maybe it's just a coincidental parallel with the saying the four corners of the earth. Like, since when does the earth have corners?
Yeah.
But apparently that idea exists, and I guess that's like a Western concept. The four corners of the earth. But apparently the Chinese thought the earth had corners too.
Well, and I don't know what the time frame from that was, right? So I have some
I have
questions.
a feeling it's from antiquity.
Well, I mean, I have some questions about that, the timing of that, because they're definitely in terms of thinking about heaven and earth was in terms of yin and yang, especially from if we go back to like the I Ching, which certainly predates the Daodejing and had some impact on it. Heaven would have been considered yang, and it would have been, the straight line, and the earth would have been considered yin with the broken line. So you had the two that were split. And I can definitely see that symbolism. And later on, especially once you start to have more of a synchreistic merging of these different ideas with Taoism into either the Neo-Taoism or the Neo-Confucianism. There's more of a, was it the Taiji, where it's the great, what is that, the great awesome, or the great something, the ultimate great, is trying to do this cosmology where it's showing kind of like the origins of things. And I think at that point you start to get shapes involved in terms of circles and squares. But I think that's actually before when this statement would have happened. And I don't know that they, even though graphically they might have symbolized it a certain way. So like with the I Ching, where you had the straight bars and the broken bars, they weren't looking at, they would never refer to Earth as being like this broken bar, right? It was a symbolic way of dealing with the different concepts. And I don't know that they would have thought of the Earth as actually square or ever talked about something like the four corners. I think that might be a little bit of a Western reading into classical Chinese thought that isn't actually appropriate, but I'm not 100% positive on that, but I haven't come across any actual places where they talk about the corners of the earth like that.
Just as a reference, I believe the four corners came from the use of maps, because that was the best kind of view people had of the earth at that point, was maps, and maps are four corners. So that's where that kind of came from.
Could be. I know from my biblical studies, they definitely, the idea of the four corners exists in the biblical text. And you know, they had a couple of different depictions of what they thought the earth was in terms of it being actually on pillars, and whatever the top part was, sometimes it was depicted as square like a table, and other times it was round like a round table, not like a sphere. So I mean, it clearly goes back to you know, certainly that time frame. Whether that was as a result of maps or not, I'm not sure, but it could be. All right. So the great vessel is finished late. So evidently this goes back to a kind of like a truism or a saying that they would have, that if you were working on some type of really substantial vase or something, that it was going to take longer, that it was not going to happen right away. And so what would be happening here, I think we could kind of run with this a couple of different ways, but maybe the idea that you can't rush it, or it could be along the lines that if you're trying to achieve some type of monumental effort in terms of what you're trying to do with the empire, that this isn't going to work out, or it's going to, you know, be really delayed or cause problems. I think there's a couple of different directions it could go. Do you guys have any thoughts on how this might fit?
This sounds like every software project I've worked on.
The more grandiose, the bigger the delays.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But it seems to be saying patience, you know, like temper your expectations for things that are monumental.
Yeah. You know, there's another passage where it symbolizes Tao as like this great bellows. And so I could see where they might try to take like even Tao into this idea of a great vessel, because it's often depicting like that empty space is where the use is or the value is. And potentially it's saying, you know, it moves at its own time too, right? Like you can't force it. Or maybe like what Dwayne was bringing up in terms of the complexity, maybe the idea is, you know, start small. Don't take on these huge projects or something. Yeah, it could go a couple different ways.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting similar feelings to like the last one was like it's about human constructs, where the Great Festival is finished late means it's finished at it, like as you said, it's finished on its own time, and your human constructs of, well, we want it done at this time doesn't play into this. It's going to be finished when it's ready to be finished or on its own.
Mhm. Yeah. The great sound is scarcely voiced. So again, if we think about the different ways that Tao is being presented throughout the text up to this point, it really makes a big point to say, if you look for it, you can't see it. If you listen for it, you can't hear it. If you try to touch it, it can't be grasped. It's very ephemeral in that sense. And it's the side, it's really trying to draw out that what we're talking about is patterns, and patterns aren't a thing that can be actually grasped. It's we witness the effects of the patterns, right? So if we're thinking about gravity, we can see the effect of gravity, but we can't actually see gravity itself, right? And the same thing with a lot of the cause and effect. We understand those patterns, but we don't necessarily have access to what's causing those patterns to behave the way that they do. And so here again, we're getting into that, you know, these things that are truly powerful in our world are things that we can't actually get a handle on. We can't actually contain or hold or even properly describe. And again, along the same lines, the great image has no form. And this certainly wouldn't be the first time that we've come across this concept. So then it kind of brings it all together, says Tao hides. It's just not, something you can get a hold on and contain and control. And ultimately, it doesn't actually have a name. The author here is using Tao because it's as close as he can come up to, but it's, how is that even really a name, right? It's like the way. It's basically calling out, yeah, there's these patterns, but what exactly that is, I don't know. And then it concludes, yet Tao alone gets things done. So in spite of its elusiveness, in spite of the fact that it seems laughable compared to how humans are trying to accomplish things, it's dark, it's rough, it's it seems like it's going in reverse, and all the challenges from the ethical perspective that it went through, and yet somehow everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. Kind of an interesting chapter. Not necessarily a lot of new information, but presenting it in an interesting way. So what do you guys think about that one? Or does it give you any fun ideas?
It's super frustrating.
In what way?
And the fact of like it's human nature to action and do things or say whatever to get things done, and this is basically saying like it just does it. And it's like super frustrating of like this is just how it works. It's very seems very opposite of what you'd expect, and I can see how it would be very frustrating of like it basically breaks all of the bounds of your human constructs of time and imagery and just about everything, and it still works.
Yeah. Well, and it's the more you understand how it works, then whatever endeavors you take up are going to be more effective, right? So, Chaz, do I remember that you like to do some shooting out there? Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are kind of like intuitive when you think about, like, if you've never shot a gun before or something like that, and you give somebody a gun and they try to hopefully with some training and safety training, you know, and they go to try and zoom in on a target. What does everybody do? They close one of their eyes, right? And you try to help them understand that you don't want to do that. You actually want to keep both eyes open, but it creates a very interesting way of trying to see the target, and how you use, you know, your sight to line things up, and all of this kind of stuff is maybe very counter to what they would expect that you're supposed to do. And then even things like understanding, if you're shooting something at a distance, that you get a drop that's going to happen with the bullet. It doesn't just fly straight. And so how do you account for that? Or how do you account the fact that, you know, wind can actually cause drift, and how you have to, maybe if you're using a scope, you have to dial that in. It's all those things that aren't initially like obvious, that is because of paying attention to those patterns, that now all of a sudden you can actually become effective at what you're doing in terms of your, you know, trying to hit your target. And I think that's along the lines of what they're trying to say here, is it's not trying to say that there's nothing to be done, but how you do things, if you're paying attention to the patterns and you understand how they work, you're going to be more effective. And if you ignore those things, or you just try to go with, you know, the way that you've been conditioned to think about it, even though if it's not correct, isn't actually going to help you be better at what you're trying to do. Anybody
In
else
my
have?
experience, there's always two possible perspectives when participating in something, which are either I'm doing this, or this is happening, i.e., the universe is doing this. Because anything that you do that you have the subjective first person experience of doing, you could also see through the perspective of, actually, that's the universe that's doing that thing. And I come to think of it, it relates somewhat to the concept of free will. If you're doing the thing, then you have free will. But if it's just the universe doing it through you and you're just kind of observing,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not really doing anything. So there is no free will.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I just actually, in that presentation that Taylor was talking about earlier, that I did last Wednesday, or a week ago Wednesday, I address a lot of that concern, but I suggest that the question between determinism, which would be the universe actually unfolding through how we are actually performing as a result of all these patterns actually participating in our lives, as well as everything else around us, where that would seem to discount the idea of free will, that really free will isn't the right word or the thing that we need to be concerned about. That rather than trying to figure out how do I break all the laws of physics, and how do I make decisions that aren't a part of my history or my genetic makeup or the things that I've learned and experienced, rather what we need to do is think about, am I a learning system? So even though everything is dependent on patterns and how the world unfolds, and it really is essential in the sense that if, you know, even atoms didn't hold to those very consistent ways of doing things in terms of those patterns, literally the whole universe would come apart. There wouldn't be anything. There wouldn't be any kind of life. And even as living things, because there's regular patterns, we can actually learn how to survive. We can understand how the weather works, what kind of things are good to eat, how to build things for shelter or whatnot. So we don't want to try and find a way out of, or to escape this idea of patterns, because that would be impossible. But if we are the type of thing that can learn, then that learned information becomes part of the prior state that these patterns are acting on, that actually then direct what's happening. And in that case, even though it's, to use Dane's terms, the universe acting through us, that unique expression that comes through us is a result of our paying attention and learning and being a part of this process that then actually shapes the direction that things go, but not because they've broken the patterns, but because they're actually a part of how those patterns function. I guess we'll bring it to a close then. I want to thank you for joining today. And if you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our live Friday morning Zoom discussion, You can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email that not only has the latest videos, but links to this Zoom conversation, as well as where we are in our public presentations if you happen to be in the Southern California area. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. Hope to see you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.